Good morning, everyone, to this extremely interesting theme of today's morning at Next Patient Week, which is fully aligned with today's day, and it's the V-Day, as Tim said in the green room before our session, that finally we get vaccinated in UK at least, right? And today's title is how can we tackle the problem of patients' misinformation? And really looking forward to this because today we have some very interesting panels. So first of all, we have Annie Buckland, acting as patient. Hi, Annie, how are you?
Hello, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Not bad, thank you very much. Geraldine from Gilead Science, the Global Patient Engagement Lead. Hi, Geraldine, how are you?
Hi, I'm very good, thank you, Dario.
Thank you. Lou Zeng unfortunately can't join this time, but hopefully we will have her on some other session. And we have Tim Ringrose, the Chief Executive Officer from Cognizant. Hi, Tim, how are you?
Hi, Dario, and hi, everybody.
So let's kick off. First of all, misinformation. Why we face such tremendous amount and percentage of misinformation? I would say that definitely technology improved our life, and I'm completely sure that we wouldn't have a vaccine for COVID so fast without technology. However, in some ways and some cases, this technology is really making some disadvantages, especially when we speak about misinformation. And there's a very interesting documentary on Netflix, The Social Dilemma, which is tackling this problem and issue that people are not trusting anymore the doctors who trained for that practice. They are rather trusting in Dr. Google, who is, by the way, on daily basis having close to 1 billion searches related to medical and other medical information. Which means this is a typical example. Headache, it's a brain tumor, right? Which means I would say too much trust in that technology instead of the traditional ways and the traditional people who practice for becoming doctors. So at that stage, I would like to pass the stage to Tim, who prepared for us a very interesting perspective, speaking about misinformation. So please, Tim, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Dario. Hi, everyone again. Well, I think we'd all agree that the human being is an amazing thing. Whether or not you believe we've been made by God or we're the product of millions of years of evolution, the human being is undoubtedly the most sophisticated species of anything. We're sentient beings with sophisticated neurological systems. We're highly adaptable creatures, and we've dominated our planet, sometimes to the detriment of other species and the planet itself. But we achieve remarkable things, such as, you only have to look at the development of the pandemic coronavirus vaccine to see we're capable of some amazing things. And we're even exploring new planets and looking to see how we can even populate planets that we didn't evolve from or weren't put on. So quite remarkable. But there is one problem that we all struggle with, and that is that we're not provided with an instruction manual. When we buy a machine, when we buy a car or a washing machine, we expect the manufacturer to provide us with instructions. Now, we don't always read those instructions, particularly, I'm guilty of that. We only look at the instruction manual when something goes wrong. But we know they're there and we can turn to them if all else fails. And these days, we can find a lot of answers online. We can go online and if we've got a problem, we can see if someone else has had that problem, if they found a solution. But we know that we can always go back to that instruction manual. We can always even contact the manufacturer to find out how to resolve an issue. But when it comes to problems with our own bodies, we're kind of on our own. We have to find out answers to health issues by trial and error, and we've been doing that since we existed. We have to find out what works and what doesn't work. When we were hunters and gatherers, we would try one herb or one leaf of one bush, and we might find that either killed us or made us ill, or we might find that it actually helped ease our pain. And we've been doing this for such a long time, and we've developed it and refined that process, and we call this clinical trials. And as we all know, clinical trials are very time-consuming, they're also very expensive. Every time we invent something to fix a problem, we have to test it against either doing nothing, or we test it against what we were doing up until that point to see if it's safe and if it's better than what we had before. Now, interestingly, you might think that we would hold the companies that develop these new treatments and the companies that test these treatments, the clinical trial organizations, in really high regard. But for one reason or another, we don't. And that's possibly something that we can discuss in our discussion this morning. But I'd like to focus on what do people do? What do we do when we've got a problem with our body? And on the left-hand side of the screen at the top, you can see the results of a review of the literature for multiple trials and surveys done in 2016, mainly US, but covering other countries too, looking to see where did people turn to for information about their health. And of course, it's no surprise that the internet comes number one. And what's changed, the internet hasn't been here that long, but what's changed in the last few years, of course, is that the internet is mainly social media. And so what we're really talking about is social media. Second, number two, is a doctor. That's the sort of traditional approach. Number three is TV, also a bit old-fashioned these days, I suppose. And then you have friends and family, magazines and newspapers. So the internet and social media is undoubtedly the most popular way to find information about your health. In 2019, one of the vice presidents from Google told us that 7% of Google searches daily are about health issues. 7% might not sound that much, but it's more than 1 billion searches every day around health issues. And I'm sure that must be much more than 7% since the start of the global pandemic. And 59% of US adults go online to find information using their smartphone, and the frequency of accessing health information online has been shown to increase immediately prior to visiting a doctor or going to the emergency room. So we're turning to the internet as the first point of call. So doctors used to be our first opinion, but now doctors are the second opinion. There's no doubt about that. So the access of the internet is one of the reasons that we do this. It's so easy. There's no queues. We don't have to make an appointment, and we can get an answer within milliseconds any time of the day. We can wake up at 2 a.m. in the morning with a question, search and find an answer. But the ready availability of information online is not enough by itself. There are some big problems, and I'd just like to highlight 3 of them now before we go into the discussion. And one of these problems is information overload. The quantity of information on the internet is simply mind-bogglingly large, and more is added every second. So this is a real problem, particularly when we consider that as far back as 1999, when the internet was just in its very early days, a study showed that more than half of health information online was unreliable. Now, I don't think you could do that study now because there's just so much information. I guess the only way you could do that would be to use some kind of AI to look at all the health information online to see if it's based in good science or not. But I think that the percentage of that has probably not changed. If anything, it could have got worse. The second thing is that psychologically, we all tend to be victims of confirmation bias. And that means that it's a tendency for us to look for information that supports our prior beliefs and theories, rather than to look for things that challenge what we already believe. So if we believe, say, that changing our diet can cure cancer and we don't need chemotherapy, we'll actively seek information that supports that theory rather than look for information that might convince us that actually we might be wrong. And this is worse. This is made worse by content algorithms, which, particularly for social media, are tending to show us things that support things that we already believe. So the algorithms are very clever and learning and working out what we already believe, and then showing things that support that. So we're in a vicious cycle there. Thirdly, large sections of the population really struggle to understand health information online. It's not because they haven't been educated, it's often because health is very complex. Just look at the COVID vaccine. And after years of study, even the most distinguished professor might have some very basic misunderstandings about health. So it's very difficult for us as the public to understand health. Even medics who might know a lot about one particular subject may have a very poor knowledge of another area of their health. So it's very hard for people generally to understand health information, and it's much harder for subgroups for whom they might struggle to read information that's not in a language that's their first language, or they might have dyslexia or some other problem. But with the relentless increase in demand on our healthcare systems, we need to be able to be more in control of our own health. So we need to be able to have good health information, don't we? But we can't simply rely on going to a doctor when we feel ill. That just doesn't work anymore. We can't afford it, and it's not the right way to ensure that we stay healthy and prevent disease. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion this morning. And I'd like to propose 3 things for us to consider as we discuss this subject. The first thing is trust. How do we make sure that health information that we find is trustworthy and based on good science? The second thing is accessibility. How do we make good information really accessible and easy to find for people, and not just for people to find, but also for people to understand when they have it in front of them? And then the third thing is relevance. How do we make information personalized and relevant to the particular issue that a person has? Sometimes you might have a great textbook that explains everything about a condition, but actually doesn't answer your particular question. So how do we provide answers to people's particular questions to make it relevant? It's a very big area, and I think one of the really interesting ways is for us to consider how we can use technology to address some of these problems. But really, I believe what we're trying to do is to ensure that we're putting the power in the patient's hands to manage their own health. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Tim, for this very interesting intro. Before we start with the discussion, we would like to ask our audience a very interesting poll, which is: do you think that there is a need for a solution to combat health misinformation? We can give like 40 seconds to answer on that, and frankly speaking, I think that the answer will be quite obvious, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Answers are easily coming in, so we can leave 20 more seconds. What's your estimation, colleagues?
Hi.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go 70%.
Okay. Let's see.
I'd go 90.
Higher.
Higher.
Okay, so 60% of the people actually responded, and the results are.
Oh my goodness.
100%.
I think that's very interesting, and most probably this is just showing that maybe we are at the front end to a new way of tackling this misinformations. So that's why I would like to start with our first question, and this is why patients can't see the forest for the trees. And I think it's obviously fair to start with a patient. So Annie, could you please answer on that particular question?
Yeah, I think my experience, because like you were saying, Tim, there's so much information online and so much more medical information out there, that when I would go and see my consultant, he wasn't quite up to date because there's so many things going on. So he would tell me one thing and then my nurse would tell me something else, and you're sort of between two professionals that you trust because you have no choice but to trust them because they're your doctors, but they're saying different things and they're giving you different advice. And a lot of it you can't understand. When I first got diagnosed, I was just in a daze and I couldn't comprehend anything that was being said because a lot of the information is quite medical, whereas you kind of need it in really basic terms of this is your diagnosis, this is the treatment path, it may or may not work, but that's where we're going. I felt like I was trying to understand why I had a condition and was it my fault? Is there a cure? Am I going to be okay? And one of the biggest things, because I work in the fitness industry, I was told you can't exercise, you can't do any exercise that impacts your knees or anything like that. And if I'd listened to that, I wouldn't be in the job I'm in, which is unbelievable. And everything going on with mental health, exercise has helped me hugely with that. I wouldn't have had that, and I could have been in a lot worse position if I'd said, okay, I can't exercise because you told me not to, so I'm just gonna sit on my sofa and hope that the pain goes. That's my experience with it. So it's very difficult to sort of, you trust your doctor because they're a doctor and you should, but you kind of figure out a lot of it on your own path with your own experience. I think the biggest thing as well is when you tell someone you have rheumatoid arthritis, for example, they automatically say, my grandma has arthritis, and it's completely different. And there's not that much information for specific diseases like this. Obviously, I can't talk about all the diseases out there because I don't know, but also my age group, when I was sort of 21, there's nothing out there to support you in that part of your life. It's just very general. Either you're juvenile and you're a child, or you're an adult and you're sort of 40 plus. That big group is very murky and you sort of get left behind. So there's no information for you to kind of excel in your life, if that makes sense. You're at a time where I was fresh out of uni, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, but then I was thrown this curveball of a disease and there was no information for me. I kind of had to weave through it all, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Amy. Geraldine, with you, please.
Well, really, we could stop now, couldn't we? Because Annie and Tim have, summarised why it's a problem, and also, what happens to individuals. And we always tell the stories that are negative stories, a little bit like we do in the news. Good news stories don't make the press. So we don't talk about the events where you've been diagnosed accurately, the system worked perfectly. We talk about the things that aren't working, and fortunately, it doesn't work perfectly all the time. In fact, Annie, I have worked in HIV for nearly all of my life, and I woke up one morning with the most terrible stiff joints, finger joints, waking me up in the night. And I rang one of my HIV doctors, because they're my friends, and said, this has happened to me. And he said, oh, you've got arthritis, that'll be arthritis. But actually, I was a menopausal woman who was having a flare, and actually I went on to HRT and it's absolutely resolved. So absolutely trusted, fantastic friend of mine, and yet that's the situation. So I think we perpetuate the fact that there is a challenge, and I think that it's very difficult for people to know where to go. The internet makes it very easy. When I started working in HIV, there was no internet, and I know that's difficult, Annie, to visualise. A lot of people that are on this call will not absolutely be able to even think, what? When was a time when there was no internet? But there was no internet, so what did you do about finding information? And I think that, as from now, sitting in a pharmaceutical company, I think we've got to take this right back to the TPP, to the target product, and involve the people that are likely to be taking the drugs, so that we are creating the correct information from the very get-go with the people that are likely to be taking the drugs that you're creating. So I think that we've just got to change the way that we're operating, so that there is a different level of trust from an industry perspective, but that you've co-created that with the people that are likely to take your medicines, so that they can really help advise what information someone living with a disease is going to need to have.
Thank you, Geraldine. Tim?
Yeah, I think the analogy of it's like walking through a forest and finding your way through a forest is a really good one, but it's kind of like almost walking through a forest in pitch darkness a lot of the time, bumping into trees and wondering if there's a bear out there or a bear trap. And what you need in those situations is someone to guide you, really. And one of the great things about the internet is the fact that it's really democratized information. So now anyone can really see the same information that a scientist or a professor of medicine would see, but we still need help in understanding it and working out what's the right path to take and what are the right decisions to make. And I think it's a really interesting point that doctors aren't always right either, are they? And medical information changes. So as you said, Annie, in the past, people with back pain were told to rest, or people with arthritis were told to not do exercise, but that's now shown to be completely wrong. If you've got back pain, the best thing to do is mobilise. If you've got arthritis, the best thing to do is to keep active. And if you don't, your disease actually gets worse. And so science changes its opinion, and doctors are not always right. So we have to make the best judgment with the information that's available to us at a particular time. But I really believe that we need support to help us do that. It's very difficult for us to make decisions on our own, because particularly when you feel unwell, with all the mental health issues, you don't feel good, it's very hard to make the right decisions, isn't it? And
Tim, we lost you. Tim?
so we really need ways to be able to make decisions with the help of staff. And I know we're going to talk about this in a second, but it's interesting to see how technology can help us to do that.
Thank you, Tim. On bottom line, I would say that like Harari, one of the greatest philosophers of today, also claims that we never lived in better times than today, and tomorrow will be even better than it was yesterday, right? So definitely great credits to the humankind. Let's move forward to the next question, and this is information silos make the patient journey quite complex, right? And how can we actually implement some kind of funnels to patients so that they really can filter the proper and the fake news which they face on the internet and on different sources, like Tim also mentioned. This time maybe we can start with you, Geraldine, so please.
Sure, Dario. I think, one of the things we have to look at are some of the amazing work that is actually going on. Groups like Patient-Focused Medicines Development, PFMD, UPADI, EPF, the NHC. These groups are all doing absolutely incredible work trying to educate all of us. They're working with regulators, they're working with the pharma companies, they're working with patient groups. They're really trying to harmonize how to get reliable information in a consistent way, systematically to people, so that we can really have reliable sources and consistent reliable sources, which I think is really, really important. I would like to see a day where we're able to get to a point where people know it's fine to go onto the internet, but where to go on the internet to really get to a point of a reliable source to find that information. I looked at the inquiries that we had during COVID. They started very alarmist, lots of misinformation, lots of concerns about the information they were hearing. Then they got to the next stage of fear about access to medicines. And then finally, the last piece of it was talking about outcomes and how people have done. And so I think that us as a pharmaceutical company have an absolute role in this, about making sure that people feel that they can go to medical information sites of companies that are working in these fields, and they'll get reliable information from them. But I think that the charities, the NGOs, have a fantastic role to play, providing really accurate information too. And clearly places like the NHS sites should be part of that too. So I think what we need to do is help people to understand. You can Google all manner of things. Tim described it so nicely, talking about the fact that there are algorithms pushing the information that we want to hear to us. But actually, we need to be able to push to people that the information, the reliable sources of information that they should go to, even if they don't like what they hear, that they would know that those sources are at least reliable places for information. That doesn't mean people don't get second opinions or third opinions if they don't like what they hear. We had a fantastic woman speak at Gilead yesterday. She's the founder of Tiger Lily. She's a triple negative breast cancer survivor. And the reason she set up Tiger Lily was because of the information that she'd been given, and the lack, as Annie described, of somebody that looked like her with that disease. And so she set up a foundation to provide that information. Now, everyone doesn't have the wherewithal to set up foundations, but we do have the wherewithal to help people understand where to go to get reliable information. And I think that's probably the most important thing that we should do.
Thank you, Geraldine. Tim, how would you define the role of that funnel? I mean, you coming from the solution vendor side, do you believe technology might be the answer?
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously a great fan of technology. I can see both sides of the coin, though. I think, what we're saying in a way is that technology is part of the problem as well as the solution. But on the whole, as you said, I think it's better to be born now than it was to be born at any other time in human history, despite all the doomsayers. We've got fantastic advances. We live longer. We have healthier lives. But there are fewer people who are in poverty, although unfortunately there's still too many. But coming back to technology, I think there are kind of maybe three ways that technology can really help. One of them is, rather than having this kind of big massive information that we just use Google search for, what if we could find sort of trusted networks so that we can find information from people we trust? That could be a qualified professional like a doctor, or it could be another patient who suffered from the same condition. And often it's other patients that we can learn most for, I think, isn't it? People who've gone through and come to the other side. And I think that technology can really help us to do that. And that's one of the reasons why we've created our platform Healthy Note, is for people to receive information from people they trust that's recommended to them. The second thing, I think, is the using AI to verify if claims made by something you're looking at or someone you're talking to actually are based on robust research. And I think that that's a real opportunity to use AI so that you can essentially fact check. There's some great organizations that fact check claims made by politicians, which often are slightly stretching the truth. Wouldn't it be great if we can do that in healthcare, that when you're talking to somebody or when you're reading an article, you can very quickly fact check it to see, well, is that actually based on some good evidence that I'm prepared to believe, or is it just somebody who's making it up, or they've actually got it wrong, or that they've got some other reason to make a claim that actually isn't based on science. And then the third thing is, and again, something that we're involved in is using technology to present information in a way that's easier for people to understand. So that could be using augmented reality or virtual reality to show something that actually is quite difficult to understand reading text. And I think that's really important, because it's not just whether the information you've got is correct, but it's whether it's presented in a way that makes sense to you and you can understand. If you've got an autoimmune condition, they're very complicated. It's very hard to understand what the hell's going on. And I think it's very hard to understand most conditions just by reading about it in text. I think if you can see something visually, particularly if it's engaging and immersive and in 3D, I think that really can help people to understand more about their bodies and their health and their treatment.
Thank you, Tim. Amy, how would you define the ideal patient journey from the beginning till, let's say, some kind of positive experience? I won't say end, because the patient journey should never end, right?
It's a weird one. It is a weird journey. Just touching on what you were saying about sort of funneling through information, because everything is online now. When you used to go and, I don't know, get a different type of medication, they would maybe give you a leaflet or a pamphlet that would put forward what the drug was or what you were going to experience. Whereas now I was told, oh, well, if you go online, you can research the drug. And then, like you say, you're suddenly presented with everything and anything that's out there, and you're reading God knows what. So that can be very damaging, especially someone who was young trying to sort of figure out what they're doing. And not that I call it blame, but it's easier to say, I have a condition because of this, or this has made this happen. So if you're looking for a reason and you read something online that fits your sort of way of thought, it's easy to go, well, that's because of that. And that might not be the case. And I remember my nurse just said, oh, there's a couple of groups on Facebook that you could join as a bit of support. So I joined one of them, and it was called My Immune System Hates Me, which I thought was quite funny. But it turned out to be very full on, and people were a lot more poorly than I was. And I felt really bad for being in that space, because I was actually okay compared to these other people. So that was a negative impact for me, because I then suddenly felt like my condition wasn't a big deal, and I downplayed it a little bit more. So there's so many things out there touching on that. But the patient journey for me, it's a hard one. So I'm kind of out the other side where I'm stable, but now again, there's no information for me what I should be doing for the next steps. It's just, I keep going from being well to having a flare. So I go back from maybe 3 weeks in between my medication to 2 weeks. And this is all that's happened for the last 2 years. What do I do now? And because of COVID, I only get a phone call appointment with my nurse or my consultant. It's very quick. It's not that personal. And it's just, are you okay? Yes. all right, go and have a blood test, check everything's fine, we'll speak to you in 9 months. So what do I do now? I just continue to go through this back and forth. There's no information out there about that. There's no, because you're well and you're not in pain, you're kind of left. So that's where I am in there's no information or misinformation and you don't know what you're doing. You're kind of stuck in this limbo of you're all right because you're not severely ill. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question? Kind of.
Okay. Geraldine, during the preparation call, you mentioned a very interesting comparison with HIV and early stages of let's say, the whole ecosystem when HIV developed. And the comparison is, at that time, actually, we didn't have too many information and obviously not many sources. So how do you compare the patient journey 30 years back with the patient journey today, when we have all kind of information, like we all agreed during today's session?
Well, of course, it's unbelievably similar for me in so many different ways. I mean, clearly this, they're both pandemics, although I noticed that WHO changed the status of HIV pandemic to an epidemic over the last few years, which is, an interesting outcome. So I suppose the big thing for me is, history lessons, things that we really should learn about and pay attention to. We had no internet, as I said earlier, during that time. So we had to wait for published articles in the New England Journal of Medicine to come together. People that knew each other, that had worked together, picking up the phone and speaking to each other and saying, have you seen anything like this? Actually, what I saw during this pandemic, during the COVID pandemic, is a lot of the physicians doing exactly that, calling each other, having the society speak to each other to say, how are you managing people in intensive care, learning on the job, trialing all manner of treatments during that time, but trying to share information together. I think what happened, that, however, during the HIV time was a lot of the stuff that we've seen really come out from COVID. So a lot of stigma, a lot of blaming, a lot of looking for who is the source of this, where did that happen and come from, and not from an epidemiological learning perspective, but very much from a stigmatizing, blaming perspective. And one of the things that we've learned is that's not very helpful. But we did see this super active group of people come together. The patients really drove a huge amount of the response in HIV. They were, we had a lot of middle class white gay men that were initially affected, certainly in Europe and in the US. And they were very articulate and very demanding of the companies to respond, to produce, to get on, to develop drugs. We were talking just before we came on air about the fact that today, the vaccine has just arrived for COVID, and from the beginning of this pandemic, just at the beginning of this year, to having a vaccine available within a year is absolutely incredible. And remember, there will be molecules that will be in development that people will have been able to look at. It's not that we were developing a molecule from scratch. We would have been looking at other disease areas, SARS, etc., and what molecules responded to those. Ebola is another example, and what treatments or indeed vaccines that could work. So it's not that we were starting from zero. Even with HIV, AZT, the first drug that was licensed in HIV, actually was an oncology product that was on the shelf and taken down to look at. So we see lessons all the time, history lessons that we can compare and contrast with. And I think that the responses were kind of more contained in a way, but equally as alarming. So maybe not Annie, and maybe not even Dario. I'm suggesting, Tim, you might remember the campaigns around the tombstones and that kind of shock and alert. And even if you weren't alive in those days, actually, these campaigns have been used to really help us to understand about how do we talk to public health issues? How do we gain and garner everyone together onto the same page? But even at that time, I remember I was working at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital, the questions around how do you contract HIV, from swimming in the same swimming pool as someone. I would have GP practices say we couldn't take a HIV patient because we're decorating the surgery at the moment. Fear, really huge amounts of fear, and I think we've seen a lot of that with COVID. If we can get the right information to people though, and still, I was looking at the top 10 myths of HIV just yesterday, people still don't realise that if you're treated successfully, you may go on to have just as good a life expectancy as anybody else. So the medicines are really effective, they work very, very well. If you take the medicines and your viral load is undetectable, you can't pass the virus on to somebody else. And I think this is really, for me, the reason I'm talking about it is because as I look at COVID and the rollout of the vaccines and all the myths and concerns people have around the uptake of the vaccines, it's really important that we get this messaging right. And if we can remember that the health literacy age for the population is somewhere between the age of 10 and 13, the way that we provide this information has to be given in a way that's absolutely understandable for people. And, it's difficult. Medicines are created by very clever people. They're rolled out by pharmacists, very clever people. The doctors look after them, they're very clever people. So to take this information and turn it into something that has a reading age of 10 years old can be quite challenging. And the best way to do that is to involve people that have a health literacy age of around that, so that they understand and help to communicate it effectively. So I think for me, from a HIV comparison, the global health response has been fantastic. I will give a plug to the fact that the HIV epidemic is not over. Every single week, 5,500 young women in sub-Saharan Africa are infected with HIV. So we've got a lot of work to do, and it's all about health disparities now, where you see that lack of take-up. And I'm concerned that we'll see the same with COVID, where the health disparities have again been highlighted during this pandemic. And if we don't get this right, we will end up in a very similar situation where we'll have a repeating escalation of pandemics in those populations. So let's not just keep repeating history, let's learn from a very recent epidemic.
Thank you, Geraldine. I would say that this leads us to information trust, right? And here I would like to ask Tim, what kind of technology we can use today to build on that information trust?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question and a tough one to answer, because I think if you look at any issue that's current in world affairs today, there's a breakdown in trust. If you look at the negotiations for the UK to leave the European Union, there's definitely a big breakdown in trust there. If you look at the development of the vaccine, there's a lot of distrust in the safety of the vaccine. If you look at politics and how people are elected, mentioning no names, there's a lot of lack of trust of different groups. So it's a very easy thing to lose, but it's a very hard thing to gain and to win, isn't it? But I think the solution for building trust is a lot of it is around transparency, and a lot of it is around consistency and demonstrating that you're providing value and that your interest is really in the end consumer. And I think one of the interesting things I'd be really interested to hear Geraldine's view about in particular, but also Annie's, is around how can we build more trust in the industry that develops products themselves, the pharmaceutical industry, because there's a Times supplement today in the UK about the pharmaceutical industry, and one of the articles is about the fact that the pandemic has actually given the pharmaceutical industry the opportunity to build more of a reputation, more trust with the general public. But the article is also pointing out that will the pharmaceutical industry make the most of that opportunity? And I think to make the most of that opportunity, the pharmaceutical industry does need to change in some ways. And I think one of the ways that it needs to change is to be more transparent about how it operates. And people are fascinated about how drugs are developed and how the industry works, how drugs are made. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for the industry to be much more open and to show how it works and to show how it does things. And I think that's one great way to build trust in the industry. But Geraldine, what do you think about that?
Oh, I agree completely, Tim. We had our second patient engagement summit yesterday at Gilead, and we invited in people from other companies that are doing great work in R&D from a diversity and inclusion. Eleanor Profito, who is the head of the NHC at the moment. As I was saying, Mima from Tiger Lily. Some Trishna, I mean, amazing people to give us advice and to talk to us and tell the company what to do. How do we do this better? How do we get this right? And I can see such a change inside our company, really talking about involving the patient voice from that, TPP, from that really early development phase all the way through, setting up patient councils, but also from a medical information perspective, having a much easier site to negotiate. Annie was saying that, advice to go and look on those sites, advice to go and look, and of course, if you arrive on those sites, they're very complicated for people, so they've got to change. In the US, it's different. There's a lot of, direct-to-patient advertising. The consumers are much more involved. They ask a lot of questions to the companies directly. That doesn't happen in Europe because we don't do direct-to-consumer advertising. And I'm not saying that that's the right approach or the wrong approach, but I do think the relationship that we have in Europe with pharmaceutical companies are very different from the relationship I see in the US because of that direct-to-consumer advertising happening. So I think that we've got to involve people earlier. They've got to co-create all of the information together with us. We've got to develop the molecules together in a much more transparent way. I feel like we're really on the cusp of a change in the way that we all operate. And I'm a big advocate for having rotations from the NHS into the pharmaceutical companies so that we don't have the health service sitting over here and the pharmaceutical company sitting over here. There should be much more ability to come in and out and work together in a far more transparent way. I'm very lucky. I think in HIV, we've had some really fantastic examples of great collaborations. Groups like the European AIDS Treatment Group, the European Community Advisory Programs that they've put on for years. They've really put our feet to the fire to really get us to talk to them about what are we doing, how are we doing it, what the studies look like, what they should look like. And I think that we need to be doing that across the board in all development for all of the products that we're working on.
Thank you, Geraldine. So we all agree from the very beginning that currently everything starts with Dr. Google, right? But how can we change that and put, for instance, the national health services like the NHS and some other, of course, on the local country level at first place? So what is the formula? Maybe Amy can answer on that from the patient perspective because she knows it best, right? Amy?
I think from my point of view, I never wanted to go to the doctor and say, I don't feel well, because I didn't want to waste time. And maybe it's a very British thing, but I was like, I'm fine, stiff upper lip, just get on with it, you're all right. People are worse off than you who need that time. So don't waste the doctor's time. So maybe I suffered in silence a bit more or tried to Google it, things like that. Because I think doctors and nurses are so limited on their time and they've got so many patients that they don't really know who you are. They read your file quickly before you go in, but they kind of skim over it. So it never feels like they know you or they understand sort of what you need. So maybe if that could be changed in a way, I don't know how you would get around that because everybody is so time poor. But I would never, I remember going once and saying, I think I was on methotrexate and I had a sore throat or something, and it's quite, you need to go and see the doctor when that happens. And I went to see them and she kind of just turned her nose up at me, and I was in the middle of this diagnosis and everything was scary and everything hurt, and she really put me off ever saying that I wasn't well to someone again. So when I go and see my consultant, he's like, are you okay? And I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm fine. So it's kind of that patient breakdown that your time and what is wrong with you is valuable and we need to know about it. And I think that would help. I don't know how you would get around that because, like I say, everyone's time poor. But yeah, I know I don't, even now, I wouldn't want to go to the doctors and say there was anything wrong with me.
Andy, let me tell you about something that we run, a program called HIV and Your Body. We have a program called HIV and the Body for healthcare professionals, and then HIV and the Body for people living with HIV. And actually, you know, they determine the agenda about what it is that they want to hear about, what's current, and kind of thinking, and they really challenge all of the HCPs in that forum, as you can imagine, to, you know, get the best information possible. And it's really interesting. What we think they want to talk about is not what they want to talk about. So I have to say, you know, sex comes up quite often as a topic that they want to talk about, as opposed to what we might think that people want to talk about. So I really love the idea of creating forums where people like yourself can have access to a group of healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, psychologists, etc. And actually, you know, when it's not just you on a one-to-one, where we could have forums where there are patients talking about, asking questions, listening to different responses from healthcare professionals. It educates the healthcare professionals, and it also provides so much information to the patient. So I think that, you know, I would be a strong advocate for thinking we need more open forums for discussion.
Definitely. And it's also, there's the medical side of it, which is there's information, but it's also, once you get that diagnosis, that's not just the drugs or the medication doesn't fix, it might help your symptoms or things like that, but it's the mental health, it's the relationships, it's the life side of things that aren't picked up on. And if someone had told me at 21 some of my hair would fall out, you know, I'd have dark hair growing on my arms and I'd have a hump on my back, I'd, you know, it's things like that that you need a voice, a patient voice, to say it happens but it goes away and you're okay. The doctors and nurses, they might know that it happens, but they don't talk about it because they go, we need to fix the problem, diagnose you, medicate you, next patient in. So definitely, I agree with you. That side of it, forums, safe spaces, information, just sharing, that would really help, especially sort of younger people that are trying to figure out life, relationships, jobs. You know, you need to flourish in your kind of 20s, and so that, I think that is where that could really help. Definitely, I agree.
Thank you, Geraldine. Tim, it was very interesting.
Yeah, you make a really interesting point about time, Annie, and you know, we know that the role of the doctor and patient has got to change. It's changed a lot already, I'm pleased to say, but I think it needs to change some more. You know, the role of the doctor should. Oh, should we do this poll?
In meantime, yeah, to save time.
Yeah. Well, please vote in the poll. And we've got to change the relationship with the doctor from being a person who makes decisions about you to being someone who helps you to make decisions about your health. One of the things starting to happen is group consultations, which, you know, I must admit, the first time I heard about it, I thought, well, that's a bit odd. But actually, it's a really great initiative, because if you're consulting with healthcare professionals, with other patients who've got the same problem as you, it can really help you to understand more about the condition. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to talk about too much about your personal situation if you don't want to, but you can learn a lot from other people talking about their condition, and I'm thinking particularly about long-term conditions. So I think there are techniques, and I also think that technology can provide us with tools and provide healthcare professionals with tools to help them to make that transition from being a decision maker about your health to being somebody who's a facilitator. I mean, that's really, I think, what we'd all really like, is that we need somebody who's on our side, who's willing to do the research and advise us based on good evidence, and that that's someone we trust. And that's really the role of the healthcare professional for the future, I think.
Thank you, Tim. In the meantime, we launched a poll, and close to 60% of the people responded. The question was, which you all know, what do you most worry about being a consequence of health misinformation? And obviously 91% poor health outcomes. How would you comment on that? Actually, I would say this is completely linked with the first polling result, right? Who would like to comment on that?
Well, I think it shows that we've perhaps chosen polls that are maybe a bit too obvious, but I do think they're really interesting answers. There is obviously a problem about misinformation that everybody agrees with. I thought that some people would talk more about the problem about poor use of medicines, but when it comes down to it, it is poor health outcomes that we're all concerned about, because that's one of the worst consequences of misinformation, is that someone makes a decision that either shortens their life or makes their life more miserable.
Thank you, Tim. Geraldine, Amy, would you like to comment on the results?
I'm happy to speak, Amy, Annie, and then I mean, I think for me, poor health outcomes encompasses all of the above. And so your concern about a poor health outcome could be because of medication, it could be because of your circumstances. But I can tell you now, I had actually the same friend who misdiagnosed my RA, by the way, was working in a big HIV clinic in London, and he moved to a clinic, I was only a couple of miles up the road, and he rang me and he said, I've got to relearn HIV. He said, because my gay, white, middle-class men are not in this clinic. This is a group of Black African women and men that I'm seeing, and they don't really care about a pill. They care about their life and their poor health outcomes, and the fact that they've got no home, or that they're an immigrant, that they're concerned they're going to be deported. Their poor health outcomes are about their social immobility, and this health disparity piece that we talk about just becomes the most important thing. It isn't about the medicines at all. It is about you as an individual living with a disease, and how do you get the best care possible. And the best care possible might be a letter so that you're not deported. So you have to look at every single part of this as individuals, and not, one size doesn't fit all. It's a really huge, we have to tackle this health disparity issue, which is going to be worse after the pandemic. But if we don't tackle that, we're just going to end up in the same situation for people. So I think that's my kind of take home looking at that graph.
Thank you. Amy?
I think just from my point of view, it's maybe not quite the same. When I went to kind of figure out what was wrong with me, one of the first things they said is, if you can afford to go private, go private. And if I hadn't have afforded that, I would have been 6 months waiting for a diagnosis on the NHS, and then my condition would have got worse. There was no kind of middle ground. You're just, either you pay or you're in pain, where there was no information to say, in the meantime, you could do this that would help, or anything like that. So my cousin has RA as well, but he's maybe 10 years ahead of me. So there was no information for him, and he was literally told to take paracetamol and ended up with bone damage. So it's that sort of, if you're not in a position of wealth or where you can afford it, you're maybe missed out a bit, and you're led to have more health problems. And I'm lucky at the moment, I don't have any bone damage, but if I'd been 6 months in that amount of pain, I would be. So there needs to be information in that area of what you can do while you're waiting, I suppose, as well, rather than just being told pay or wait. Yeah.
Thank you. And we are coming to close this interesting session with our last question. So we are left with 5 minutes. So I would kindly appreciate like 1.5 minutes of answer on each of you. And this is how the patient information journey will look like in the upcoming years, and after this whole pandemic finishes, 2030 and something, right? Just kidding.
Yeah, if we're still all here.
Who would like to go first?
Happy to have a go.
Okay.
I think that one interesting area that we haven't really talked about yet today is around preventative health, and how we can prevent disease rather than simply respond to ill health. And that's where I think we can make the biggest progress in helping to preempt damage. So, in Annie's case, I'm really glad that you've got treatment quickly, but we need to not wait till people feel ill, but to have systems and services that can help us to identify when we need to make some kind of change, or whether something needs to be investigated to prevent us becoming ill. And I think technology has a great role to play. I saw a an article yesterday you might have seen that showed that actually wearable data can help people to understand when they might be starting to feel unwell with COVID. So even before you've got symptoms, your watch might have detected that you're moving less, that your heart rate's gone up a bit, and that you're not sleeping so well. So I think we can start to use technology and to gather that data in meaningful ways to help us have an early warning system when we need to do something. And I think that's going to make a big impact, because we all know that it's the long-term conditions that cause the bulk of health expenditure. And the other thing that I think we can look forward to in the future is not having to go to hospitals. The old-fashioned ways of needing to go to the hospital when you feel ill really should be a thing of the past. There will be some times when you need to go to the hospital if you need an operation, but it should really be a very minority of cases. We want to be able to stay at home, don't we? We want to be able to be managed at home. We want to be able to live our lives, do our jobs, and live with our families. And I think that remote-based care is something that's really taken off with COVID. And it's now normal to do a remote call with your doctor or your nurse, which you've done, Annie. And we can get better at it. It's not perfect yet. And I think that it's more a case of having frequent interventions rather than waiting. People used to go to see a doctor with a whole list of things that they've been storing up. I need to ask you about this, and to ask you about this. If you could have regular pieces of information fed to you when you need them, by your watch, by your phone, that would really, I think, help us to think less about disease and ill health and think more about making the most of life.
Well, if you have an Android smartwatch, then still it's Dr. Google, right? Okay, Geraldine, Amy?
I think the future is doctors, patients, pharmaceutical companies working together. There's got to be sort of a collaborative idea of helping each other, and I think patient involvement is the way forward. The drugs are out there, the medicines, everything is developing so quickly. Like Tim said, we're healthier, we don't need to go to hospital as much. So I don't think it is. Some diseases it might be more development in drugs, but especially for mine, it's out there, but it's just getting it to the patients, the right information, working together, learning what works, what doesn't, how we can help each other. I think so much more collaborative. I know from my point of view, there's lots of things that I want to do to help patients within the RA community, which I need to sort of execute, which I feel would help, just providing information, support groups, and the other side of life away from medicines as well, bringing those together, because they work hand in hand, and people will be happier and healthier and probably get more out of their medication with the health benefits of mental health, and it's all combined, isn't it? And I think it needs to come together rather than just being medication, pharmaceuticals, patient. Yeah, so that's what I think the future is, working together and including it all.
Yeah, I agree, Annie. I think that's exactly right. We have to, do this together, because if you're developing a drug, we will want to use all that digital technology. We've seen people not being able to clinical trials not enroll during this pandemic because we can't get to hospital. So we've got to find a bridge to make sure that that doesn't happen. We've got to make sure that we're retraining people, that if you're not going to be seen so frequently and that the health systems are going to change completely, then that can't just be dictated from the healthcare systems. We need our patients to also help determine what does that look like. And what we know is that some people are delighted not to go to a hospital or see a healthcare professional if they can get on with managing their disease, and other people really need that reassurance, whether that's from a mental health perspective or from a physical health perspective, but they want to know that they've got access to a healthcare professional on a regular basis to speak to, communicate with, whether that's digitally or physically or remotely. But we have to make these changes together. It's really interesting that before the pandemic, there's been lots of discussion about changing health systems you know, that they could be much more remote. We could see people less often. It's not great filling A&Es up with people, you know, with diseases. That's not a good use of resource for an individual or for the health systems. But to make these changes really stick, we need to do it together. It has to be a collaboration of all of the groups together and governments with us.
Thank you, Geraldine. With that thoughts, I would like to thank you all for taking part in this extremely interesting session. I already can claim this will be my favorite session because I definitely believe that misinformation is a serious problem and that we need to tackle it from different directions. We made our conclusions. The session will be published on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it on demand, free at any time in the future. So once again, thank you very much. Stay positive in mind, negative with COVID, and hopefully we will meet each other in some upcoming years at least, right?
Lovely.
Thank
Thank you, Dario. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.